Welcome to The Pestle, reviewing and breaking down movies to look for insights into the movie-making process. Hosted by Red Rum. All work and no podcast makes Jack a dull boy. Let's kill the light and start the show.
Welcome everybody to The Pestle. Today's show is brought to you by Mr. Tortugas. When traveling to distant lands, skip the local establishments and get hammered at Mr. Tortugas. Welcome everybody to The Pestle. I am Wes.
And I am Todd.
And we are filmmakers. I'm a writer-director and jack of all trades. I do some animating, 360 VR stuff all over the place and act. Todd's an actor, musician, producer, all kinds of things. And we use all of that as a method of analyzing films and just enjoying it. What's wrong with enjoying a good story, Todd?
Nothing. That's why they tell them.
I like where your head's at. Deep. We're deep here. Yeah. I think there's a lot to talk about in today's episode. So I think let's dive right in. What are we covering today?
Today we're covering George Miller's 3,000 Years of Longing from 2022. If you haven't seen this film, pause the episode and go watch it because we're going to spoil a bunch of stuff. At the moment, it is streaming on Amazon Prime Video, so shouldn't be hard to find.
Shouldn't be hard to find. We'll definitely look at a lot of things. Some of the cinematography, how compositing, motion blur, and depth of field help tell this story, as well as much as I can, the story and writing side of this thing, which is a behemoth. Enzo, storytelling itself, and other such stuff and things and stuff.
And a quick synopsis of the film. A lonely scholar on a trip to Istanbul discovers a Djinn who offers her 3 wishes in exchange for his freedom. It's directed by George Miller, written by George Miller and Augusta Gore, based on the short story by A.S. Byatt, cinematography by John Seale, featuring Tilda Swinton as Alithea and Idris Elba as the Djinn.
You mock me.
3 wishes, perfectly simple and theoretically safe.
I was imprisoned by Solomon precisely because I cried out my heart's desire. Only by granting you yours may I earn my release.
Yes, well, I appreciate the symmetry, but the thing is this. I cannot for the life of me summon up 1 eligible wish. And you're asking me for 3.
Is there any life in you? Are you even alive?
You know, in some cultures, absence of desire means enlightenment.
Then you are a pious fool.
If I'm content, why tempt fate?
And you're a coward.
Don't goad me.
There is no human, no angel, no Djinn that wouldn't grasp at the chance to fulfill their deepest longings, and I am saddled with the one who claims to want nothing at all. Alithea Bini, you are a liar.
You know, I am beginning to wish we'd never met.
No, don't say that!
Ooh, so I am like itching and dying to know. It's a deep story about stories, and I have no idea. This movie did not do well in theaters, and I'm curious, is that a fault of the film, or did you enjoy this and you think, maybe people missed out? How did this land for you?
So it was entertaining, I will say. So entertaining to me that it was late one night this week, and I decided like, oh, while I'm doing something, I'll put it on, right? But on my phone, I'll like start it on my phone.
Jesus,
right? Just
Todd,
while you're
watching a movie on your phone. Who are you?
I know. I just started it. I was like, because a lot of times at night I'll put the kids to sleep and whatever, and I'll come back into my room that I spend all of my days in, and I'll do a little bit more either work or I'll work on some music or something. And I did that, and then it was like 11:30, and so I said, okay, I'll just see what I'm in for, because I'd heard of it, but I'd not seen it, and I didn't know what to expect. So I was like, I'll just watch like the first 10 minutes, but I don't want to, whatever. I ended up watching the entire movie on my phone.
What? On your phone?
I know, it's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. It's so dumb. But I gotta be honest, and I'm not, it's so weird because I'm not saying I even liked it. I'm not saying that it made total sense. I'm not saying that like it was so intriguing that I needed to watch it on my phone. I just didn't want to stop watching it. And I don't know. I have this kind of, the vibe that it has is a really cool vibe that we've talked about with other films on this podcast, where most of it, except for the flashbacks, are set in one place. You know, it's like a lot of it is like set in her hotel room. Not all of it, obviously. There's a whole section before she meets the Djinn, before there's flashbacks and everything, just to like set up who she is, which I think is cool. But a lot of it is set in her room, and so I really like films like that are that don't try to go everywhere and do everything. They just want to live in one place. That being said, that's what kept me there, but that's also why I didn't like it necessarily, because of the flashbacks. The flashbacks tried to go everywhere and did everything and stuff, and as wonderful as it was, I felt like, why are we spending so much time? We're spending so much time in both places that I don't feel grounded. You know, like we've seen other films where most of the film is told in one place, and we spend almost the entirety, if not the entirety, in that place. And so I feel grounded and safe in that place, or safe is a relative word, but I feel like I belong in that place. But in this film, I felt like, because there's this big section at the beginning away from her hotel room, and a big section at the end away from her hotel room, and there's all these flashbacks in the middle, I'm pulled in so many directions that it's kind of hard to feel like I belong anywhere. I feel like instead of feeling like I'm part of the story, I felt like I was outside of the story, like almost not invited in, to be honest. All that being said, it was entertaining. Idris Elba is fantastic in this role. I love him to death. And I think he's a great Djinn. Tilda Swinton always brings it. I think she's wonderful. But it just didn't fully land with me. I don't think it's because I watched it on my phone. I really don't.
I don't know.
Please, everybody who's listening.
I don't know, bro. I'm going to disagree. Like, you didn't commit to it. Like, it's hard to be like, yeah, I really committed to this film and I watched it on a 6-inch screen. I mean, you might as well have watched it on a Game Boy. Like, I don't... It's not immersive. There's a reason we go to movie theaters, though. Like, the immersion is so much greater in a theater. And I think inversely, the immersion gets kind of stripped away the smaller you go. You don't think so?
I mean, no, I do think so, but I don't necessarily think that I didn't get, like, I think the visuals were amazing. I think I can get the story.
Yeah.
The story is what I'm talking about. I'm not saying anything about how it didn't look good.
Right.
It looked amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm saying immersion, not in the sense of the visuals. I'm saying in the bigger it is in your eye, the more you can lean into it. Not because, the graphics are better, but because it's more present in you. The ability to actually more meaningfully engage with, like, the emotions. Whenever the characters are so small relative to your environment, you can't read the emotions quite as well. It's not that you can't recognize them. I'm saying I don't think inherently the impact is going to be as strong because of that scale difference. I mean, this is definitely why I like a big screen TV. I don't need a 105-inch TV in my room, but I don't actually have a 105-inch TV in my room. But
I was like, what?
that's your wall. You just described your wall.
Okay, but what you're saying, I agree with what you're saying, but I also have to say that it had nothing to do with that. It really had nothing to do with that. There's plenty of things that I can watch on a large screen and not like, and watch on a small screen and not like, or vice versa. Like, the reason I just got stuck watching it, and I stayed up late watching it. That says something about like the fact that I didn't want to stop, and that's what I was That's what I was trying to get at.
I just
right?
find this an interesting conversation because I know there are a lot of people who watch movies on their phones. And so that's why I think it's worth kind of pushing back and having that dialogue, because we've never discussed that in particular on the show before. So I believe you in terms of you were engaged. It's not like maybe for the first few minutes you weren't. If you're doing laundry or something else, there's probably minimal engagement as you're not present. You're kind of half watching. I do that too with some movies. Like I was telling you before, I rewatched the first 3 Mad Max films with Mel Gibson. And the first one, I was totally engaged the first 12 minutes. And then it got into story mode and I was like, wait, where's my laptop? Because I'm going to keep watching, but I'm not giving it 100% of my life anymore because this just took a dip. I was still able to get the story and, pause my laptop while something that was interesting pulled me in. But there is still something that I think is interesting about people who regularly watch movies on their cell phones while out in public or whatever. I think on average, you probably are missing a lot. And a lot of it is more to do with the emotional side of things. Just because of that very simple reason of your ability to stay focused and watch it. Especially a lot of people, I think, that are walking around or on a bus or something. Like you can watch it and I'm sure there's some emotion that creeps in, but I wonder how much of that is minimized, especially on a first watch. If it's a repeat watch and there's already that built-in emotional connection, you probably lose a lot less. But if it's your first watch, I wonder how much you are losing in that first initial experience. Anyway, I don't know. I find it interesting, and I'm certainly, not someone who's never watched anything on their phone. Like I used to keep 2 movies on my iPod back in the day. One of them was Night of the Living Dead, and the other one was Man on Fire. And I watched Man on Fire on my laptop, in a netbook, not like even a full-size laptop, like a miniature, basically smaller than an iPad, and had a great time in wherever, Nicaragua. But all that aside, anyway, to address what you actually said, I find that is interesting that you're pointing out most of it takes place in a room. And obviously, I don't think that's unintentional. I think it's intentional in a number of ways. First is that this being a movie about stories, the idea that she's out and about, but she locks herself into a hotel room to engage in, it's what we do with books, right? You read a book and you're transported to all these other places. So her being, and the Djinn being kind of a form of a book, she's being transported to all these other incredible places in the same way that you would, reading a book or watching a movie, which there are very direct parallels being made in this, movie about those 2 specific aspects. And then the other aspect is having a place that roots us in a hotel makes it so much easier to keep track of this parallel story that's being told. Like if we weren't in the hotel, then you might start to lose track of it. It probably gets a little tiring they're moving around and then the story is moving around, and how are you keeping track? Whereas every time you go back, you have these clean images and it's very easy to keep track of when we're in real time versus when we're in the Djinn story. I think there's a practical element to that as well as the kind of metaphoric thing that's happening throughout this story. But that said, still, I think there's like 8 minutes in the beginning, and it's funny because you're right. There is this big opening, so to speak, and it only lasts like 7.5, 8 minutes before she actually meets the Djinn in her hotel. But that's a lot is happening in those 7.5, 8 minutes. She's on the plane, she's in the airport, she's on the van ride, she's checking into her room, she's in the conference, she's passing out, she's having this conversation, she's shopping. Like, you are just bang, 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 bang all throughout that first 8 minutes until she meets the Djinn. Like, it feels like a good 20, 30 minutes of runtime, even though it isn't. Similar, I think the end of the film is probably like 15, 20 minutes whenever she finally makes her wish and gets into the London. She travels back home. that's another quick, whatever, 15, 20 minutes of stuff that feels like another half hour. This movie, hour 48, and change, feels like a good 2.5 hour movies just because of how much story happens in that short amount of time. I think it's an incredible use of runtime that a lot of other filmmakers could probably benefit from studying a little more closely. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know where any of that's going other than like, I think you're right. There's so much happening, but I do think there is a reason why they're so stationary, throughout that runtime.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, there is like 10 minutes at the beginning and then like 20 at the end. And then they do kind of have to stay stationary, in a place. So we have a place to come back to. I get that. I don't know.
And they're homey, right? They're in their robes and they're kind of warm. And even though they're not tucked in, it feels like they're tucked in every time you come back. Yeah.
And, when I was watching it, when she like asked him or wished for him to love her, I was like, not really, I don't know. That really took me out of it. I wasn't feeling that at all. Like, I felt like the whole time she, I don't know, acted like she didn't need anybody or anything. And then it was almost all of a sudden, it felt like that she was just like, you know what, I want you to love me, and that's fine. I guess that's fine. But cause it just kind of took me out of it. I thought. And then the whole end, was beautiful though. Because he did it. You're sitting here wondering, well, is he doing it because she wished him to, or is he doing it because, he wants to? And then when he's set free, essentially, he comes back and spends time with her. And then you realize, oh, okay, no, he does love her. I don't know. I guess it is beautiful, but it's I don't know. It's in just like a very uncomfortable way for me,
Yeah.
It's not like and which is fine. I'm okay with being uncomfortable. Like the typical love story is very, you're the one, there is no one else forever and always. And in his case, that's not the case. Well, in her case too, apparently, but in his case, he describes multiple loves he has throughout his existence, in detail to her. Right. So in the end, she's another one, I guess, but he's free. And so he's free to make his own choice and comes back to her. I think that is beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm
going to stand by it. I think you shot yourself in the foot with the emotional side. And maybe not, because you do have different experiences. But maybe there was a deeper emotional well that you would have pulled from, on your more normal viewing experience.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so at all.
Because it's just funny. Like I feel like I predicted that response. And then here you are saying that you weren't emotionally engaging, with her, because that moment you're talking about, I know exactly what you're talking about, in terms of that moment she falls in love. For me, it didn't feel random at all. It felt like her reaction to him falling in love. And she had been resisting. I mean, that's one of the interesting aspects of the film is her resistance to all of this, the appeal of making a wish and having desire at all. She had convinced herself to no longer have desires. And in fact, there's a brief moment earlier in one of his stories. What is it? Oh, whenever he's cast into the sea, right? Solomon bottles him up for the first time, casts him away. And he talks about his first 100 years in the 2,500 year staycation, so to speak. Yeah. And he's like, I prayed and I begged and I cried, and then I made I tried to trick myself by wishing that I would never leave. And she asks him, did it work? And his response was, to pretend to yearn for nothing? No. It can't work. And that's what she's been doing. She's been trying to trick herself into wanting nothing. Pretend you just don't want anything. And in that clip that we played, she even invokes the idea of like this Buddhist, kind of mentality of there are some people who find the lack of desire to be enlightenment. And he is just point blank like, then you are a pious fool. There's nobody who wants nothing. And to not want anything is to not even be human anymore. Are you even alive in there? And he's like casting all kinds of judgment on her. And then I think on a macro level, one version of the story is about her casting judgment on herself for her lack of because at the end of this, she closes the book. Like, this is a story that she's been telling us. And so is this story, is this real or not, is pretty fascinating. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know where any of that was going anymore. Just talked myself into a loop.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Sure.
I'll run through. Well, before I go through my notes, my first experience watching this in theater was this nice little tension of, we're all familiar with the Djinn, genie, trickery stories. And I love that plays such a critical role in this story, because you don't know if you can trust him. You don't know if these are all lies that he's telling her. And what level of deception is he getting at in order to get what he wants? And how is he going to use it against her? And so you do get to the end of the movie and you're like, because like you were just saying, you don't know if he really loved her until he comes back. And that's, I think, what really ended up selling me on this movie was, I don't know of any other movies like this. This feels like a pretty rare film in presentation and expression, and in its resolution, where it's a happy ending, where normally in this kind of story, it's not. There's always some wink at the camera of, actually, it was all blank. And this feels like every intention is to make it as real as possible to you and to give you something that is hopeful and beautiful. And there's so many layers that I didn't pick up on my first viewing, though, that I wish I had started watching this earlier in the week so that I could think about it more and make more notes and tie it up, because it's very loosely, in my mind anyway, this is a very loosely, I see all these pieces and I'm going to do my best to like thread them together. But I'm doing my best here. This feels like a storyteller's story. And I'm still building out the equipment to be able to tackle this kind of thing. And so I'll start though with the cinematography, because there's a lot that's interesting visually that could pull you out of the story, because there's not a lot of motion blur. There's a lot of very sharp images, and there's also not a lot of deep depth. It's very deep depth of field. It's not very shallow. It's, very deep. And I think they're doing these things, and the compositing often feels very composited. You can feel it even when it's funny, because there's a lot of scenes where there is no compositing and it still feels composited. And I think this is all very intentional. It's not sloppiness, or it's not, George doesn't know what he's doing. He's up there and his cinematographer is pulling one over on him. It's none of that. This is all super intentional. And I think it's there to give the story a very storybook feeling. It's to make you feel like you're being pulled into a children's storybook for adults. And all these things, the sharpness of the images and the compositing makes it all feel alive, and it's popping out and it's vibrant, just like you would as you're flipping each big page in these pop-up books. And that's what it's there to feel like. And I thought they brought it to life just wonderfully. And the more you go with it, and for me, my first viewing, I will admit, it took me 10 minutes, 15 minutes to really buy into it. And I was trying, and I was like, they're pushing against me. But eventually, once the Djinn starts telling his stories, you just can't help but just fall into that world, and want to hear where the story is going. What happens next? Okay, now we know how that, but where's that blue bottle? Because, so many of the bottles are these very metallic things, and you're waiting for him to get to this beautiful blue and white vase or whatever. And So you're just compelled to like, what happens next? And it's like a campfire. You're just kind of sitting by a campfire listening to these people tell you these stories. And it's so beautiful. And another thing that is kind of cinematography, it's kind of directing, it's kind of writing, it's all these things, it's production design that I thought they did really well were these very quick visual stories that are kind of just told in an image. So like in the second story of the two brothers, or maybe it's the first story of the father who ends up killing his son, which is brutal, but done in a way that you can feel it, but it doesn't violate you as a viewer. It's really delicate storytelling. But the father is starting to be carried away with his poetry and love and and he gets pulled out of it. And I love that moment whenever he gets pulled away from his poem to witness his son being worshipped by the guards. And his son is, you can tell visually that the son is like, no, stop. Like, I'm not your sultan or your ruler or whatever, king. And we cut back to the poem on the table. And it's this image of ink spilling over onto his poem, ruining it. And it's spilling over like blood. And it's this beautiful vignette, just in a single image, telling the whole story there. Suleiman has abandoned his poetry and then goes on to kill his own son, in fear of betrayal. And that's such a cool shot of his son, having his spikes turned against him to root him into place, and he gets cut. And I love that there's no pianos back then. So what do you use instead of a piano wire? And it's like they unstring a bow, this tool of violence, to carry out another act of violence. But it also kind of invokes, again, piano string, which is a whole other concept of something that is used to make beautiful music being used to kill someone. And so I think it's tying in kind of the piano wire imagery with the poem, and using that as a method of corruption and, something that was his heart yearned for beauty and it was turned to violence. All of that I kind of pulled out of that one single image, but even just that one image is conveying to the viewer a very simple idea of abandoning poetry in favor of violence, with the ink and the blah, blah, blah. The next image I pulled out was Zephyr, the third story of the woman who's trapped in her tower, and falls in love with science and mathematics. And she, through the Djinn, has sex with her husband, and it's that shot of her husband looking up into the heavens, bliss on his face, as flashes of Sheba and Solomon kind of cross his face, and his eyes suddenly dip into these black holes. And it's very simple, but in a single image, you understand that the husband's lust cannot be satisfied anymore. It becomes a seeping black hole of desire. And it's very quick and simple, but very telling too. And then the other one, and there's probably just tons of these throughout the film, but is Alithea returning home after she gets her first wish. And then as she's going through the city is blue, but she is warm in this kind of orange color, whether she's at work, at a cafe, on a train home, right? It's conveying very simply that she found warmth and love in a city of isolation. And it's just, you feel it. It's not something that you necessarily see and think, oh yeah, I understand. It's like something you just feel. And I think those are all feelings that they're communicating through just these very quick visual images. It's very, very smart. And the depth of this whole movie just astounds me. But into the story and writing, and of course, jump in as thoughts, jump in. The narratologist I found interesting. I've never heard of that. I thought maybe they made it up, but narratology is a real thing. I did have to Google that, I'll admit. But it's the study of story and tales and how they relate and what they communicate and all those kinds of things that she is clearly describing. But what I find interesting is the narratologist is a modern Djinn. It's like a version of the modern Djinn. And so the narratologist conference feels like a parallel to when the Djinn says he misses the realm of Djinn, and she's asking, well, what do y'all do there? He's like, well, that's where we gather to tell each other stories, and it's our lifeblood, right? This is what brings us meaning to our lives. And it's the very same thing that she's doing at her conference, right? Well, it's very similar. It's like the inverse. He is the modern Djinn, or he is a Djinn who's telling these beautiful stories, and her job as a narratologist is to deconstruct it all and to kind of take out the mythology and inject science into it. And that's really fascinating. And we'll certainly be coming back to that in a minute. But at the conference, everything was a story, right? They're discussing how mythology was giving meaning to seasons and catastrophes and all aspects of life. And what she says is mythology is what we knew back then. Science is what we know so far. Sooner or later, all mythology is replaced by science, painful science, and all myth is reduced to metaphor. Like, there's something very painful about hearing someone spell that out, because we yearn for still myth, even as we're, trudging forward in science. And it's not that science is bad. Science is very good. But there is a certain beauty and meaning that it can strip away from our day-to-day lives. And so we find, I think, just largely society still battles with that. Like, even something like astrology is trying to use science as a method of injecting story into our lives. Like, I believe 0% of any astrology, but I don't fault people for trying to use that and find meaning in it, because it's rough out there. We all need stories to get through the day, Todd.
It's true.
And so
Amazing.
Let's talk about Enzo, because Enzo was something that really washed over my first viewing. I did not put it together at all. And I'm still only kind of putting it together. But the first story that really gets told here is her story. And she's like, well, before you get started here, buddy, don't kick off your shoes yet. I need to make a confession. And this is when she tells a story about being in a school for girls. And she describes her loneliness as a fortress of solitude or some such thing. And it makes it sound like a brave decision, which maybe it was. I mean, I certainly knew solitude as a kid. Also knew friendship. I had a lot of friends. And looking at her, it looked like she didn't have a friend in the world. Whether that was self-isolation or rejection from the group, we don't really know. Both are okay, but from the story's perspective, she chose isolation. But I love that they kind of invoke a question there visually without telling you one way or the other. And what she says is that Enzo suddenly came to her during her loneliness, and told her stories in a language only they spoke. And so Enzo was stories themselves. And if you're watching the movie, this is a visual movie. You can't depart the dialogue. And this is what's one of the best uses of voiceover, is giving you not a contradiction, but more information that is also being potentially contradicted visually. Because she's presenting one reality and we're watching another, because she's reading a book. And Enzo only appears to her when she's reading this book. And what she says is, he would go away, when I had a headache, but he always stayed when I couldn't move during my asthma attacks, which we watch her trying to breathe, and she's looking. She's not reading, though. And so I think she was probably watching TV. We just don't see it in frame, because she's trying to present this other idea of what her life was, that she had this friend, this guy that would come and tell her stories. And so what she says, though, is that he was an emanation of an absence, which is it took me a minute to kind of wrap my head around that phrase, an emanation of an absence. And I think what she's saying is there was an absence of friendship. And out of that absence, she created a friend through these stories that she was reading. And so she tried to tell his story, and that's what she says next. I tried to tell his story by writing down every single fact that I could think of about him. But the more facts that she wrote, the less real he felt. And by the end of it, he didn't feel real at all. And she abandoned her story about Enzo, threw him into the fire. And I think in part that's a commentary about what makes for a good story. It isn't about facts, right? It's about feeling and imagination. And science strips away stories. And that's kind of what she's wrestling with, the idea of, well, I want to tell the story about Enzo, but I don't know how to do that yet. And I think ultimately that's why she becomes a narratologist, is because she can't tell her own stories. All she can do is analyze others, which strikes home as the Pestle goes on each week. I feel your pain, Alithea. And so that's interesting. But what makes it so much more interesting and painful, that is not spelled out in this movie whatsoever. And if you blink, you really do miss it. You have to be super engaged. And I don't know if this is, did you pick up on that she had a miscarriage?
Yeah.
Like, that was such a crazy, I think I did, like, in
it's
the
theater.
Box. Yeah. It's it's in her scrapbook that she then tucks away into her box.
In the box, and then puts it in and then she puts all his stuff in a box next to it at the end.
At the end, yes. And so I must have been making a popcorn order or something in the theater, but I did not remember this aspect of the story at all. Or if I did, it was just a glance and then I forgot it. But Alithea tells her story about being divorced and like, we married early and we had love and we enjoyed each other's company and bodies. And as she's saying all this, we're looking at her scrapbook that shows snapshots of their relationship, and it ends with her pregnancy test, and then underneath that is a sonogram with a caption. The caption says, "The first and last image of little Enzo." And it's just this very quick portrait of a miscarriage. And then, she turns the page and there's nothing. It's just blank, empty pages afterwards. And that's the end of that story. And she never invokes the idea of her miscarriage ever again. And even getting her to tell that story was brutal. He had to really coax it out of her. If you played the run up to that moment, he's like, I really need to know, like, who's my captor? And like, he's just pressing her. She's resisting and she finally relents. And she still only tells part of the story verbally. And the other part you have to watch and pay attention to visually. But that's a really interesting thing, because it starts to invoke another question. Did she try to bring Enzo into this world? Or was the story of her childhood friend her attempt at telling the story of her loss? We do know that she says, the way my brain is wired is the source of both my power and my solitude. I find feelings through stories. And so it's all tangled together. Like, maybe, her childhood friend was her version of her miscarriage, or maybe, her miscarriage was her way of naming this thing that didn't come to fruition in the same way that she couldn't tell her own story. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe, this is just all her way of coping with, loss. It's beautiful. I don't know. I think it all works to tell her story and why this story is happening at all. But it is important, and I will come back to it because I think it's important to the ending. From there, we go into the Djinn story. And what's fascinating about him is his bottle itself. She picks the blue-white bottle at the bottom of a pile in the back of the store. And when she does, she's looking at it and she wants it. And her friend comes up, "This is my gift." And what does he say? "Oh, it looks like it's been damaged by fire. Pick something else." And she says, "I'm sure it has an interesting story." She wants it anyway. And what I find interesting about that is the bottle itself is a mix of blue and white, right? It's a swirl. They're kind of swirling, mixing together, which to me visually is invokes the idea of melancholy and lightness. And when you factor in that the container itself has been damaged, much like Alithea, it's like the womb of the bottle itself has been damaged. There's a very interesting visual story, again, that goes untold. It's just there if you inspect, which I did not on my first viewing. I was just so swept away with everything. And so his stories that he's telling seem to have them both embedded inside. Sheba swallowed at, as she fell in love with Solomon. He's playing the lyre or whatever, Solomon played. And then, she swallows that gulp like, oh God, I'm falling in love. And then towards the end, Alithea gulped as she fell in love with the Djinn. And she fell in love with him as she's telling the story of falling in love with Zephyr. And that's her falling in love with a story. And that's how she realizes feelings. Right? She finds her feelings through stories. And so Zephyr also bounces her leg as she studies. Just like in the beginning, Alithea bounced her leg as she studied on the plane. There's that shot of, that we boom down from her studying her books to reveal her bouncing little leg. And so it's hard to tell if the Djinn is incorporating these details. I don't think he could have incorporated that detail because he wasn't there to see her on the plane. And so this leads me to believe that one version of the story is that this is all in Alithea's head. This is her coping mechanism. And we'll come back to it. I'll try. And so you get to Alithea's wish for love. And it's interesting because, again, this whole tension of the film is, how is the Djinn going to trick her and use her wish against her? And what I love about this story is ultimately it's not a trick of the Djinn, but of her own design, right? I wish you to love me and I'll love you too. I want the love professed in ageless tales. I want the storybook love. And she's asking for a love that exists only in fairy tales. And it's so ironic because immediately as we move into the swirl of the cosmos, as there's probably having sex, and she immediately notes, love is not something to come by reason. It's like a vapor. And the invoking of a vapor is also interesting because when we go to Zephyr, it is this whole other, it's invoking all these aspects of motherhood because it goes through these 5 stages of electromagnetic, which to me is like this idea of love, and then vapors, the coming together chemically, the particles, and then it ends on whatever stage 4 or 5 of the formation of organs. Because if you're not factoring in the idea of, her miscarriage, that'll just pass right by you. It's like, oh, that's a weird thing to throw out there. Where's that going to, circle back to? Well, it's there the whole time, right? And so how can it be? And then she asks, the Djinn asks her, how can it be a mistake to love someone entirely? Still, I think invoking the idea of her miscarriage and trying to cope. How can you... Part of it's probably her marriage too, because she acts like she was unfazed. She witnesses him cheating on her and is like, oh, thank God, this relationship is over. And I don't know. I think all of this is her refusal to engage with her own story. Okay, so then we move into... she's asking for love that... I'm sorry, my notes are all over the place. And then eventually, so love is not something to come by reason. It's like a vapor. But eventually she understands her own trap. That the genie could never tell her. She had to, the Djinn could never tell her. She had to realize that herself. Which was, the moment I spoke that I wish for you to love me, I took away your power to grant it. Which is really fascinating because stories cannot give us everything we need. But, and this goes back to I think the culmination of the ending in the park, she's finishing her story and she's reviewing her manuscript. And what's interesting is there's this little moment that happens on her bench. She hears behind her a child calling out for his mommy. And she turns and doesn't look, but suddenly that's when she gets a visit from the Djinn. And he's comforting her, I think. But he also kicks a soccer ball to the kids playing. And I think it's to show that he's real and has a real impact on the world. Because, circling back to something that was said earlier in the film, you exist only if you're real to others. Do you agree? And she said, I do. he's real to her. He's real to the world. Very cool. I got one other little note, but what do you make of all that? The tying together of her story with the Djinn. Do you find it more interesting that the Djinn is actually alive, or that she finds him alive in order as like a mechanism for dealing with loss?
I think that's all super insightful, and think like, man, you've got some amazing notes here. I feel like the idea of not existing if you don't offer the world something is a little, I don't know. I don't personally tend to agree with that necessarily. I think that plenty of people can exist and have existed without that, or without the need for that, and are okay with that. But in terms of him existing in the end, I think that final shot of him kicking the soccer ball, I agree. I was wondering that, actually. I didn't have a solution for that. I was like, why add that in? But I think that makes total sense, that to tell us that two things. One, he does exist and does influence the world. Two, he's still pretty awesome. With what he does, like what he does with the ball is pretty amazing, right? And then he gives a thumbs up to the kid as he walks away. That's right. Which I thought was cool, like super. Exactly, which is not something you would do if you're 3,000 years old necessarily, but that if you're a part of today's world, you'd probably give a thumbs up, and a kid says thanks, you're like, whatever. Which is so funny, because yesterday I was playing soccer with my son and I kicked the ball over the fence, and this guy who was riding by on his motorcycle, he turned around, got off his motorcycle, grabbed the ball, ran across the street, threw it back over the fence, and then got back on his motorcycle and started driving away. And I was waving to him like, thank you. And he gave me a thumbs up. There you go. So I do like that. This is a very complicated and dare I say it, complete story, where we get visual visual storytelling from a lot of different angles, and there's a lot of stuff that like you could miss. I just feel like, I mean, it's look, I go back to this kind of vibe in every movie that I see, where I'm sitting here and I'm watching the movie from a critical point of view, and I think, why? And then in the end, why did this person make this decision? And in the end, they just did. And that's the story. So while I am about to say what I'm going to say, it is the story. It is. Why do I drink coffee every morning? Because it is my story, right? Whereas someone else would be like, why does he drink coffee every day? Why is he drinking coffee right now? Because, that's the answer. But with Alithea, she goes against everything that like I know her as a character up until that point, when she decides to make her wish to be loved by him, and which, like you've already attested, goes against knowing if he really does love her. And, she has said before that she doesn't, she's worried about wishes. She's worried about wishing for the wrong thing and about it backfiring on her. How can that be the right wish? It feels like that is the opposite of the right wish, right? To have the Djinn himself loving her when she knows that that's not necessarily what he wants. He's not there to love her. In all the other instances, he is talking about falling in love with the person, not the person wishing for him to fall in love with them. So her wishing for that goes against her knowledge of story, of this story of a Djinn and three wishes and going, like making the wrong wish. But I guess that's the story, and she can't help herself in that moment.
In part, I think also it came as a result of trusting him. like there were moments along the way where he could have lied, that he said things that were against his own interest, that I think slowly build trust. Because, I mean, you're right. Like, for her to suddenly be like, okay, I'm going to make a wish and I'm going to make it a doozy, takes a lot of turnabout. But I think it comes as a result of things like she asked him at one point, did it matter to you what kind of a wish a man like that might make? Talking about the guy that he was trying, one of the two brothers that he was trying to persuade to come find him. And he was like, no, not if it meant my freedom. Like, I would give that mofo anything. It's like, damn, that's brutally honest. You would think he would say something a little bit more like, well, yeah, I wouldn't obviously hurt anyone. It's like, nah. Like, and so I think there's just those little kind of moments along the way that are persuading her that he is being authentic. And that matters a lot to her, because, and this is like part of her character, I think, not just as a narratologist and kind of a scientist in that way, which is rooted in her name itself, Alithea. I had a feeling this had a Greek root, and it does, which stands for verity, which is truth. And so her whole being is centered around reality and truth, and being wooed by a good story. That's the best I can.
But why? But trusting him, trusting him only means that now I can make a wish.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be that wish, right? Again, this is the story. It is what it is. And this is an interesting story of, I want a Djinn, this powerful being who I now trust to love me. But, it just felt like a massive jump, from going from, I'm not going to wish for anything, to I'm going to wish for you to love me. It felt like a big jump for me.
Interesting. It didn't at all, obviously, for me, just because I felt like they stepped their way through all her objections. Because she kept throwing those out, not as a means of permanence, but as a means of, these things need to be overcome. And slowly along the way, him telling her stories and him addressing her concerns and battling with her. Like, you are a pious fool. Like, there's no one who doesn't desire something, and to deny that is to deny yourself humanity. And so he's doing his best to overcome all those objections while they're being raised, for the sake of the audience, for us. And I guess at the end of the day, it's just a matter of, do you go with it or not? And for me, I didn't have a problem going with it, because I felt like those were all the objections that I had coming in. Like, why should she make a wish knowing what she knows about this whole process? And so along the way, she's throwing all those roadblocks up, and he's winning me over along the way too.
But that's but to me, it's like, I'm not going to make a wish at all for anything. And then, okay, I do trust you. I'll take a Porsche. There's a it just was like, I'm not saying she should have wished for a Porsche. I am just saying, like, there was a massive.
No, but they addressed that too. I feel like they addressed that too with her joke about, I wish for a sip of tea and I wish for like, his whole point was, this needs to be your heart's desire. And so when she finally makes a wish that he tries to grant, it comes from that place of vulnerability that she's been covering up and trying to pretend doesn't exist. I don't know. I feel like that's addressed. It worked for me for sure.
Sure. Great.
Okay.
Great. I will say that this is one of the first films I've seen that's made since 2019. Not first films, but one of the few films I've seen since 2018, since before the pandemic, that actually looks like a pre-pandemic film. I mean, I see Mad Max shit all over this. Like, the speed ramps, the zooms, the fast camera moves. I don't know how he does what he does cinematography wise. Like, it is very George Miller in so many ways. And I mean, anything from just like a normal hallway shot to, them running through a hallway to a very still slow-mo scene, like the still slow-mo scene of after the girl kills herself or not kills herself, but gets thrown into the ocean, and he jumps in to save her, and he doesn't quite save her, and she dies, and that static shot of them sitting together, and he disappears. Like, even slow motion still shots, they were so gorgeous. It was beautiful. That might have been the main reason I didn't want to turn it off on my phone. Just because everything looked so gorgeous and everything felt very motivated. And you're right. Like it was hard to imagine so much happening in such a short amount of time. I mean, I think the runtime is like like an hour and 40, hour and 50.
Hour 48.
45 or 48. Okay. That's a lot to happen in that short amount of time. It begs you to pay attention for sure. So it's beautifully shot in a way that I didn't feel like was done in the previous 3 years of cinema, honestly, since the pandemic,
Agreed. The other thing that I was really impressed by was just the depth of this world. It's just immense. Every few minutes, there's like these references and throwaway lines that build out the world building and touching on this mythology and that mythology. And there's things in here I don't know. Like there's when he's just discussing Solomon, and it's like he learned her name through, from a whisper from an Ifrit, and then whenever he's trying to, that moment you're talking about when he dives off the cliff, he was like, I was blocked by a follower of Amit, or some word that I've never heard of. And I was like, I don't know who that is, but sounds real. Like he's pulling all this stuff from real literature and mythology, references. And like the two brothers, when they were kids, and he's telling that story, that starts with the boy trying to wedge this stone loose with his sword, and he can't do it alone, but with his brother, he comes along, and together they both start to loosen it. And I love that. It feels like it's probably a metaphor, like King Arthur, about ruling together would have been better, instead of trying to rule separately. And I feel like this whole movie is just all kinds of layers that, went into it, that I will never have any clue. Or there's probably got to be like a website that's just like, in scene 1, second 5, like there's this. It's just astounding to me how much referencing and world building is going on pretty effortlessly. Well, that's all I got. Final thoughts,
That's
man?
it?
Yeah.
Nothing else? All right. I'll make you a deal. I'll go watch it on the biggest screen I possibly can now.
Okay.
And see.
Give it a while. Maybe
happens.
not immediately after, but give it whatever, a few months. And then you'll come back and be like, oh, I've kind of forgotten bits and pieces. What's this about?
Yeah.
Yeah. How about that?
Okay. Okay. And I will give my honest thoughts.
Okay.
Honest thoughts. If I really think that it made a difference, I will let you know.
Nice.
But I think it says, hey, listen, I think it says a lot that I didn't want to turn it off.
Yeah.
That like I was just sitting there like, oh, I'm going to have some cereal or whatever at midnight. And I was, an hour and a half later, I'm like still watching the thing. I think that says a lot. I think it did a lot in a very short amount of time. I think that the performances were really great. I think the storytelling was cool. And the visuals were amazing. Very George Miller in a great way, in the best way, in the new Mad Max kind of way. And which is like super interesting in a kind of a love story. You know what I mean? It's a love story setting. There was just a lot that I didn't like too, but that's okay.
Nice.
So yeah, I'll do that and I'll be honest.
Word. I dig it. Nice. Yeah. I loved it. I walked out of the movie theater just feeling in awe, just feeling like I haven't seen a story like that in a movie theater, maybe ever, but if not, in a really long time, because how often do we get original stories? Even if this was based on a short story, I felt like they built it out and made it as big as they possibly could while still making it really intimate, and centered around just two people in a room talking. And this is, to me, a story about storytelling. And I was just in awe that George Miller still taking risks, and not enough people are doing that. And I don't know if this didn't do well because it was an R rating and there's some curse words and some nudity, but to me, it all felt in place and worth it. So I don't know.
That was going to be my next question, was just why do you think this didn't do well?
I think people are full of shit. That's what I think. I think people will talk a big game about we're so tired of superhero movies, and then you assholes go and just watch superhero movies. How about you go buy a ticket to something that isn't that doesn't have a big marketing budget, that they're not spending $200 million on to tell you about? You need to go support independent, small, unique pictures. Or else, guess what? We're not going to have movie theaters anymore, and you're going to have another 50 years of Star Wars and Marvel films. Is that strongly enough put for you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Okay. It was very well said.
Thanks. Then stay tuned for
That's
next
exactly
week.
what I wanted.
Oh, stay tuned next week. Oh, wait. Going way out of sequence here. Yeah. What are you going to recommend this week?
So this week I'm going to recommend an artist who I recently I discovered about a year ago. Never had heard of him before, and I don't know how I discovered him, but I just heard a song and I was completely enthralled. And then my daughter was trying to go to sleep and she wanted to listen to something, and I said, How about this? How about Novo Amor? And she was like, who's that? And so I put it on, and now every night to go to sleep, she'll listen to this artist. And I recently bought tickets for her and I in October to go see him. She's never been to a concert before. She's 8. It'll be her first concert, and she's so excited that like she will watch videos of the guy performing and stuff. And yeah. So I'm going to recommend an artist named Novo Amor. I think he's from England, and it just gut-wrenching, beautiful, beautiful music. Just look him up and you'll see. It's amazing. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Nice. I will be looking him up. And of course, y'all can check the show notes for it as well. I'm going to recommend a book. It's called Backwards and Forwards by David Ball. It was written like 80 years ago, like the mid 40s, give or take. And it's really just about dissecting stories, specifically plays. And it's funny because to me, I think it's aimed at directors of plays, but for me reading it, it felt like maybe one of the best books about writing scripts that I've ever read, just because it's not actually trying to teach you how to write. And that's what I loved so much about it. It was more about what makes for good writing, what makes for a compelling story. And he really hammers home like Hamlet. Like he turns it in. I don't know Hamlet that well, but it made me want to go and read Hamlet all the way through. Like I've read passages, and I don't think I've maybe seen a film adaptation at some point. But it was just like, oh, wow, that's really fascinating. And just a really smart way of looking at story and storytelling and character and action. And why is Hamlet the way he is? Is he really depressed? And he completely destroys the notion that Hamlet is either mad or depressed, which is the only way I've ever heard Hamlet presented. And he's like, no. If you're thinking that, you're completely misreading what Shakespeare wrote. And he proves his point like beautifully. And so, yeah, it's a fun read. It probably hard to find though. I had to buy it. I don't think I found it on. I mean, maybe it is on Kindle and I just ignored it. But I definitely wanted the paperback. And so if it's on Kindle, that's more than enough. Because, I'm a writer, I wanted to be able to mark it up or not mark it up, but reference it quickly by flipping through pages and passages. Sorry, I don't actually write in my books. If it's what you do, fine. Just don't sell it.
Yeah.
Anyway, stay tuned for next week. We're going to take a look at Jumanji, Welcome to the Jungle. That's the first of the reboots. If you call
Speaking of low budget films.
Yeah, right. Independent original films.
Yeah, right.
Jumanji sequel. Welcome to the Jungle, the Kevin Hart, The Rock, Karen Gillan, and Jack Black film. And so stay tuned for that. And if you're enjoying the show, don't forget, subscribe, drop us a review, and leave us a note if there's something you want us to cover, kind of things you find interesting. If you want to comment on this episode in particular, you can do that at thepestlepodcast.com/3000 years of longing.
And our quote of the day for today is from Alfred Tennyson. If I had a flower for every time I thought of you, I could walk through my garden forever. Aw, is that for me?
Yeah, it is.
It's for me. Oh, I knew it the second I read it. I love you too, buddy.
I actually wrote a whole short film around that passage. I just found it, so beautiful. And it's about loss, or at least my story was. I can't remember what the full poem is about anymore. But it's just a wonderful idea that, the things that we think about and we, whether it's a story or a memory, we bring life to it, to the effect that it fills your life up. I love that. I could walk through my garden forever. Yeah, very nice.
Amazing. Well, this is fun. I love disagreeing with you. We should do it more often.
Yeah.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode, this conversation. I know I did. Make sure you join us next week when we're covering Jumanji. If you like this episode or any other episode, please subscribe, review us wherever you get your podcasts, and share us with your friends because it all helps. And if there's a film you'd like to see us review, please let us know. Who knows? One day we might do it. Until next time, I'm Todd.
I'm Wes.
Go watch some movies.
On television.
It's not that big of a deal. Wherever you want. Doesn't matter.